Hello, everybody. I'm Vanessa Weisbrod from the Celiac Disease Program at Children's National Medical Center, and I want to welcome you to our webcast today about gluten-free baking, alternative grains, and nutrition. During today's webcast, I hope to convince you that gluten-free baking with different types of alternative flours and ingredients can be quite delicious, and talk about the different nutritional values of these ingredients, how to make them into mixes, adding gums to them, and using some types of alternative fats to boost nutrition and reduce fat. So we're going to jump right in and start by talking about almond flour. So almond flour is very commonly used in the gluten-free community. You see it in many packaged products that are labeled as gluten-free, and it can be a wonderful ingredient to use in your home kitchen. It's made from raw blanched almonds that have been ground into a fine powder. And what's interesting about purchasing almond flour is that the different brands will have different textures to them and different finenesses to the flour. So it's really a great idea to play around with the different varieties of them and see which one you like best. I have a picture of a Bob's Red Mill bag here, but this is not the only brand that sells gluten-free almond flour. There are many of them available on the market. Almond flour is packed with protein and fiber and lots of very important other nutrients that can help your body. It gives your baked goods a very soft texture, and it actually reduces the overall total carbohydrates in baking. So it's a great flour to choose for people who have both celiac disease and type 1 diabetes. You can use almond flour as a one-to-one replacement, but we like to use it as a mix. There are cookbooks that are all about using just almond flour for recipes, but in our own practice with it, we think it works best when you blend it with other ingredients like buckwheat flour and coconut flour. And then just to point out the actual nutritional value, that it is very high in protein and low in carbohydrates. For every quarter cup of almond flour, there are 3 grams of fiber and 4 grams of protein. So moving on to coconut flour, it's made using ground, dried, defatted coconut meat, so just straight out of the coconut. It has a very, very high fiber content in it. So you actually need to add a little bit more liquid to your recipe in order to have good results with using coconut flour. You could use things like coconut milk, water, you could use seltzer. I love actually using seltzer in place of liquid in baking. It gives it a nice puffiness or just a little bit more lightness to it. And I also tend to blend my coconut flour with other naturally gluten-free flours. Like I had mentioned before, I love doing a blend of coconut, almond, and buckwheat. The flavors are great together, and it really does add a nice, well-rounded nutrient profile to your baked goods. Coconut will give your baked products a rich texture and a natural sweetness, which actually means you can cut down slightly on the amount of sugar that you're adding because of the natural sweetness. It's also high in fiber and low in carbohydrates again, with a quarter cup of coconut flour having 11 grams of fiber and 5 grams of protein. It is also important to note that there is a higher saturated fat content in coconut flour, about 2 grams for that quarter cup. So you are going to want to take that into consideration with your baked goods and just think about the full nutritional profile of what you're making. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later. So brown and white rice flour are perhaps the most common ingredients that are used in gluten-free baking. Most packaged products that you buy in the grocery store will contain one of them. They are made in the same way from finely stone ground white or brown rice grains, and they can absolutely be used interchangeably in recipes. The biggest difference is in their nutrient profiles. Brown rice flour would be the whole grain version, whereas white rice would be the refined grain version. Brown rice flour is packed with protein, iron, fiber, and vitamin B, and it contains that healthy rice bran that gives the darker color to it than the white rice, which is, you know, a crystal clear white. White rice flour is made from the refining of brown rice, and it can also tends to be gritty when used by itself. So that's why we like to see it as part of a blend, just like with the other flours we've talked about. Now, what's important to look at with the nutritional value of these is that brown rice flour has double the fiber of white rice flour, and that's because when you refine the grain and you strip it of many of these nutrients, you lose the nutritional value of the grain. So it is always preferable to use brown rice flour as opposed to white rice flour to keep your nutrients higher in the products you're baking. So Teff flour is one that is not quite as commonly used in the United States as others. It comes from Africa and is traditionally used to make injera, which is the bread in Ethiopia. Teff is the smallest grain in the world. It has a very light yet unique flavor, and it is again a 100% whole grain flour. If you've never been to an Ethiopian restaurant, I would strongly encourage it. They make injera, which is a flat bread. It's very spongy, and you use the bread to soak up all the sauces in the wonderfully flavorful food. But one note of caution, in the United States, oftentimes restaurants use a blend of teff flour and wheat flour. So anytime you do go to an Ethiopian restaurant, you do want to make sure that you're getting 100% teff injera before eating it if you're on a gluten-free diet. Teff is also a great source of fiber, protein, iron, amino acids, vitamin C, and calcium. So it's a great product to use. And again, a quarter cup has 5 grams of fiber and 5 grams of protein. So millet flour only recently came into my life, but I've absolutely fallen in love with it. It is a very mildly flavored flour, and it gives a very delicate texture to baked goods. So I love using it in cakes. You can replace about a quarter of the flour in your recipe with millet flour. It's packed with nutrition. It will give great texture to your birthday cake. So I would highly recommend trying it out. And again, it has this very, very mild flavor. So I like to mix it with flours like sorghum flour and almond flour as a blend all together. It's also a good source of protein, essential amino acids, and fiber, with a quarter cup having 3 grams of protein and 4 grams of fiber. Sorghum flour is perhaps my favorite alternative gluten-free grain to bake with. It's made from whole grain sorghum that is ground down into a flour. The starch in sorghum actually takes longer to digest than other flours, which is great for those who are managing celiac and type 1 diabetes. It has a very smooth texture, which is great for baking, so you get none of that grittiness that's often associated with gluten-free baking. And brewers will often malt the sorghum grain and then use it in gluten-free beer. So this is not to be confused with malt barley. So we talk a lot about malt being unsafe for a gluten-free diet, but that's only when we're referring to malt when it's barley, the barley grain being malted. But malting actually refers to a process. And you can malt any grain you want. You can even malt strawberries. So brewers have been actively malting the sorghum grain and then using it in gluten-free beer, which is quite tasty. So sorghum is also high in protein, iron, and fiber, with a quarter cup having 3 grams of fiber and 4 grams of protein. Tapioca is also a pretty popular flour in the gluten-free world. It's slightly sweet, but very, very, very starchy. So unless you're making Brazilian cheese bread where you want it to be really sticky, you're always going to want to combine tapioca flour with other flours. I most often do it with quinoa flour or brown rice flour. It's a great addition to baking. Tapioca flour is made from the starch that's extracted from the cassava plant. And it really gives this wonderful crispiness to the crust of baked goods, and it helps keep the inside really soft and chewy. So it's one that you definitely want to add to your breads. And again, if you've never tried Brazilian cheese bread, I would highly recommend it. It's made with 100% tapioca flour, cheese, water, oil, eggs, and salt. Just Google the recipe. It's amazing. You will be very happy you did. So, like I said, tapioca is very smooth. It can also be used as a thickener for sauces, pies, and soups, and as a replacement for cornstarch. You would want to use a little bit more than you would with cornstarch, so about 2 tablespoons of tapioca for every 1 tablespoon of cornstarch. And the negative part about tapioca is that it is basically nutrient void. There's no fiber and no protein. So compared to the other grains and flours we've talked about, this one is very low on the nutritional scale. That is not to say that it's bad, but just as something to think about as you're thinking through the overall nutritional profile that you want to maintain for your diet. So soy flour is another great gluten-free alternative. It's made from soybeans that have been ground into a powder. It gives a lightness to baked goods, and it has this lovely natural nutty flavor that is just wonderful in baking. We don't recommend using more than a 30% replacement in your recipes because it can burn very, very quickly. So when you first start out using soy flour, we like to recommend using a recipe that has been tested and that you know is going to hopefully come out the way you want it to. But it doesn't, it definitely browns much faster than the other flours, so don't be alarmed. And it definitely helps to lighten the texture of gluten-free breads. So it's a great one to use. It's also high in fiber and protein, 3 grams of fiber and 10 grams of protein. So buckwheat flour is a confusing term in the gluten-free world. Despite having the word wheat in its name, buckwheat is actually related to the rhubarb plant. It's made from whole ground buckwheat seeds, and it is naturally gluten-free and safe for those with celiac disease. It has very high levels of fiber, which may help to stabilize blood sugar levels. So again, this is a great choice for people who are on a low glycemic diet. It's also a great source of protein and calcium, and you can use it in many different ways in baking. Typically, I like to say to use about half buckwheat flour in your recipes, but there are many, many companies who sell pancake batters that are 100% buckwheat, pancakes and crepes. They come out great. So, just again, test it out and see what you think. For every quarter cup of buckwheat flour, there are 4 grams of fiber and 4 grams of protein. So now I just want to take a second and look at a comparison of nutrients in all these different flours. So here is a list of the flours that we've talked about today and what their nutritional values are for a quarter cup. And at the bottom in red, I have the nutritional value of wheat flour. And what you can see here is that many of them are right in line with wheat flour, but some of them are not. So in particular, if you look at white rice flour, corn and potato, and tapioca, these are the most common ingredients that we find in gluten-free packaged products. And you see a whole lot of zeros and ones in those categories. And the problem with this is that because these flours are lower in nutritional value, when we replace with the gluten-free alternatives, we are getting far less nutrition than we would if we were eating the traditional wheat-based products. So I like to point this out as a thought process that I want you, when you go to the grocery store and are buying gluten-free food, to start looking at the nutritional label and thinking about the type of nutrition that's in those products that you're buying. And perhaps instead of buying the white bread version, try the multigrain, or try one that's made with some of these other wonderfully nutrient-rich gluten-free alternatives. And just try it out. Give them a shot and start thinking about the value of nutrition in the gluten-free food that you're eating. So now let's talk about making our own gluten-free flour blends. I know that some of us like to just buy a bag of all-purpose flour and start making it in our cookies. But for others, it can be a really fun activity to make your own all-purpose blends. So here's how you do it. The first thing that you want to think about is making a large batch ahead of time, because the worst thing is, your son runs in and he's like, Mommy, I have to take cookies tomorrow for Shabbat. And it's, 7 o'clock at night and oh no, I have no flour. So I always like to make a lot of it at the same time, and I'll often freeze a bag just to have ready to go at any time. You always want to store it in an airtight container. And I would definitely recommend trying a variety of these before, settling on one, because you might find one that's okay, but then you might want to find one that's absolutely amazing. So try them out. So this first blend is your basic flour blend. And this is what you're going to find in most gluten-free products that you buy in the grocery store. It's a starchy blend, it's very easy to make, and it's the lowest cost of any that you'll find in the gluten-free world. So these ingredients are found in most mainstream grocery stores, and you just blend together the brown rice, cornstarch, tapioca flour, and xanthan gum, and you can store it in an airtight container for up to a month and then use it as a one-to-one replacement in your baking. Now, don't worry about scribbling down all these recipes. I'm going to make sure that everyone gets a copy of the slides, so you'll have it for yourself to print off later. So the second blend that I like, and this is one of my favorites actually, is a high protein and a high fiber blend. It's made with sweet white sorghum flour, tapioca flour, coconut flour, and xanthan gum. It brings protein, iron, antioxidants, and dietary fiber to your baking, which makes them, much better nutritionally. The tapioca gives this very thin and sturdy crust to baked goods, so it's wonderful in things like banana bread or lemon poppy seed bread. And the coconut gives a slightly sweet moistness to the bread. So it's one of my favorites. So you're just gonna blend these four ingredients together. And again, you can store them in an airtight container and use it as a one-to-one replacement in baking. The third blend is a high protein, low glycemic blend, and we use this in many of our classes at the hospital. It's a combination of buckwheat flour, almond flour, coconut flour, and xanthan gum. It's great for cutting down on carbohydrates, but boosting your protein intake. Almond flour, again, it's naturally low in carbohydrates, but it adds tons of protein to the blend. And again, just like the other two, you're gonna mix these ingredients together and store them in an airtight container for up to a month and use them as a one-to-one replacement. So now when it comes to all-purpose flours, there are dozens of them to look at in the grocery store, and it can often be confusing because they all have different types of ingredients in them. The biggest thing for me is that I like to find one that has a gum in it already, because if it doesn't, I have to buy a gum and add it to it. So let's talk about what that means. So a gluten-free flour is most effective when it has a gum. And the reason for that is that it replaces the gluten in your gluten-free flour. So what does gluten do that's good? It provides the dough factor. The gum will help mimic this missing element when you add it into these flour blends. So when you take away gluten, you can no longer stretch the dough or make it elastic, and in a lot of cases, hold it together. So the xanthan or guar gum, it gives this doughy property, not 100%, but it does help to replace this property that's missing in gluten-free flours. They also work as an emulsifier, which means that it can help liquids stick together that might not otherwise stick together. And they can also work as a thickener to help batters become more viscous. So what's the difference between them? The biggest difference between xanthan and guar gum is how they're made. They both keep your baked goods stuck together, but they're slightly different in how they're produced. So guar gum is made from a seed that comes from tropical Asia, and personally, I think it works best in cold cooking preparations, things like salad dressing, ice creams, and custards. However, there have been plenty of times when I didn't have xanthan gum on hand, and I threw some guar gum in the recipe, and it worked absolutely fine. Xanthan gum is made from a microorganism that comes from lactose or sugar, and it works best in baking or hot food preparations. I will most often buy xanthan gum when I want to bake with it, but again, you could use them completely interchangeably. The quantities will vary slightly, but for the most part, you're going to be looking at about a quarter to a half a teaspoon for every cup of flour that is in your recipe. So now I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about alternative fats for baking. So the first one that we're going to talk about is avocados. You can actually use avocados as a one-to-one substitute for butter in your baked goods. I know this sounds crazy, but as long as you don't mind your baked goods turning green, it's actually a wonderful replacement and can add over 20 vitamins and minerals to your cookies. So it is a wonderful trick to try, and I would highly recommend it. Using avocados instead of butter will dramatically reduce the amount of saturated fat by almost 75%. And it definitely helps your gluten-free products stay very soft and chewy instead of dry and crumbly, which is very characteristic of gluten-free products. I do this all the time. I've made pound cake using avocado. I've made pie crust using avocado, cookies all the time, especially like double chocolate cookies, because you're putting cocoa powder in them anyway, so they're darkly colored and you'll never notice the green. But they're just an absolutely wonderful addition to baking, and I would highly recommend trying them out. Another great substitute is plain Greek yogurt. I like to recommend about a half a cup of Greek yogurt plus a half a cup of oil in quick breads, cakes, and muffins. It helps keep everything very soft and moist. So one of the big questions that we always get is, what is the difference between Greek yogurt and regular yogurt? Greek yogurt is made by straining the yogurt to remove the whey, which is the liquid that remains after the milk becomes curdled. And the result of doing this is you get a much more solid yogurt that has less sugar, fewer carbohydrates, and more protein than your traditional yogurt. So that's why we recommend using Greek yogurt, plain Greek yogurt, in your baking as opposed to your more traditional yogurt that has much more sugar in it. Greek yogurt contains twice the protein of regular yogurt, And we always want to recommend using the plain version because the flavored yogurts typically have added sugar to them. You can replace at a 1-to-1 ratio, and there are lots of blog sites out there that highly recommend doing this, but we believe that to get a more true texture that seems similar to your regular baked goods, that you want to go with a half to a half replacement. Another great alternative for baking is using olive oil. 1 tablespoon of olive oil has just 1.8 grams of saturated fat compared to 7.2 in 1 tablespoon of butter. So it's a huge difference. And by using this replacement, you can really cut down on the amount of saturated fat. We always recommend using extra virgin olive oil to get the most benefits out of nutrients and antioxidants. Now, I've tried to create my own graphic to show you guys, but at the end of the day, Colavita just has the coolest graphic of using olive oil as a replacement for butter. So thanks, Colavita, for letting us use this graphic. Here you can see that for 3/4 of a cup of butter, you would replace with half a cup of olive oil plus 1 tablespoon of olive oil, or 1 cup of butter would be 3/4 to a cup of olive oil. And finally, unsweetened applesauce. I do this all the time with my kids. You can use a half a cup of applesauce plus a half a cup of oil in quick breads, cakes, and muffins. It's a great way to cut down on calories and to boost fiber. The one thing is that you will definitely get slightly sweeter products, and they're going to be super soft. So I definitely would not recommend doing this all the time for cookies unless you're okay with like a very cakey cookie, but it's still totally delicious. So again, you'll be most happy with a ratio of 1/2 applesauce to 1/2 oil. And I would highly recommend doing this in things like quick breads or cakes as opposed to cookies. So now I'm going to turn it over to questions. We have about 5 minutes left to answer questions. I'm going to give everyone just a second to be sending them in. If you have any trouble, there is a questions tab, and there's also a chat tab, and you can submit them to either of those. Vanessa, what is your favorite gluten-free flour? That's a great question. I would have to say sorghum is probably my favorite gluten-free flour, but I really do like using them as a blend. I use almond flour quite often, not only in baking, but I use it for things like breading chicken tenders. I don't always like buying the packaged pre-made chicken tenders for my kids, but I will often buy raw chicken and bread it myself, just dipping them in a little bit of egg and then rolling it in almond flour and then baking them. And they absolutely love it. It's delicious, and I actually posted that recipe recently in our celiac program digital app. So if you haven't downloaded the app yet, it's the Gluten-Free Diet Digital Resource Center and available free of charge in the Apple iTunes Store or the Android Marketplace. If I use the starchy blend of flour, should I always replace the fat? That's a good question. So I think that it very much varies depending on the recipe you're making and what your nutritional goals are. I think that for everyone who's diagnosed with celiac disease, it's very important that you meet with a dietitian to talk about what your nutritional goals should be and what type of nutritional value you need to be getting every day out of the food you're eating, so that you can start really creating an eating schedule for the day that fits into those goals. Personally, I like to always replace fat in my baking with one of the alternative ingredients. And it's just because I can't always wrap my head around 2 sticks of butter in 1 batch of cookies. But are there times that I do it? Absolutely. So I think that, any of these things in moderation and just thinking through having a generally balanced diet is the way to go. Are there any of these flours you avoid? Not particularly. I think that I cook the most infrequently with Teff flour, only because it's not quite as widely available as the others. But for the most part, I tend to switch it up and keep variety in my house. I also use quinoa flour quite often. I think it's great for baking. I've made 100% quinoa cookies that were delicious. They were very earthy tasting, but they were absolutely incredibly delicious. Can you buy any all-purpose flour blends that use these other types of ingredients? For the most part, the answer is no, but there are a handful of companies like Enjoy Life Foods that uses ancient grains in their blend, and Bob's Red Mill also has an ancient grain blend. So there are a few that are making all-purpose flours with these other ingredients, but the one thing to expect when you do buy those is that the price is going to be substantially higher for far less product. So just keep that in mind when you're searching for them. My local grocery store has none of these available. Where can I get them? That's a great question. Amazon. Amazon is by far the greatest place to find these ingredients, and I buy them there all the time. Most grocery stores tend to have at least some of these available in the store, and if you wanted to buy them in your local store, you could definitely speak to the manager about ordering them for you. But again, there are great deals online, and Amazon ships all of them very quickly. Sometimes even same day delivery, depending on where you live. I tried cooking with, sorry, this is a great question. I tried cooking with soy flour and it was a total disaster. The cookies spread all over the pan and burned terribly. How do I fix it? That's a wonderful question. I'm so glad that somebody asked this question. So like I mentioned during the presentation, soy flour burns super fast. So you definitely want to make sure that you've picked a source for the recipe that is a trusted source. So, lots of times there are bloggers that will post recipes, but they don't necessarily have pictures of them, which is an indication that maybe it didn't come out great. So I would always recommend picking a soy flour recipe from a very trusted source. The first time, because if it hasn't been tested, you're really, going into uncharted scientific territories here. It definitely burns very quickly. We often have people send us questions about trying to use soy flour to make a roux. And it will work. It will absolutely work to make a roux for a sauce, but it will get very dark very, very quickly. Can you send us the recipe for the cookies on the screen? Absolutely. I will pull the recipe and for these meringues, and I will include it with the presentation document links. All right, well, we are out of time for today, so I would like to thank everybody for joining us. And if any additional questions do come up along the way, you can reach out to me at any time. My email is Vanessa Weisbrod, vweisbro at childrensnational.org. I'm happy to answer your questions anytime. And thank you all so much for joining today, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.